Hi, everybody. It's Louise again. This is part 2 of my story. In my last video, I shared when Eliana lost consciousness and the last time I heard her voice. You know, if you experience something like this yourself, understand the feeling of helplessness. There's nothing really we can do. You want to do so much for your child, but sadly, sometimes we can't, and we have to leave it up to a higher being to help us. I will continue to share my story with you. Upon arriving at the hospital, I was ushered into a small waiting room. I sat there in disbelief. I felt so numb and confused. Once again, I bowed my head into my hands, thinking, please God, help Eliana. Don't let anything happen to her. Please, please. I must admit I felt very frightened sitting there alone with so many thoughts running through my mind. What we had experienced was unforgettable because this happened so very quickly. Several minutes later, the ER doctor came into the room with a sorrowful look on his face. He sat down directly across from me, and without mincing words, he told me that Eliana was bleeding in the brain. They had already performed a CAT scan, which showed signs of hemorrhaging, and that Flight for Life were on their way to fly her immediately to Children's Hospital for surgery. I could not believe what I was hearing. I could feel my heart racing, and my breathing had become shallow. I couldn't really get my words out because the news hit me hard. I started to shake. How is this possible? I thought to myself. I wished so hard that this was a bad dream and that I would wake up any minute. The ER doctor asked me if I would like to see her before they flew her to Children's Hospital. I remember standing up in a confused state as he led me out of the room and took me to her. At that time, I felt like the beginning stage of shock. None of this made any sense to me at all. Eliana was perfectly fine a couple of hours ago, I thought, and now she was unresponsive. There were many nurses surrounding Eliana's hospital bed, preparing her for Flight for Life to Children's Hospital. I was able to go by her, and I whispered in her ear that I loved her, and I stroked her head. I began crying because it was so very difficult to look at her this way. This wasn't Eliana. Eliana was the bright, cheerful girl I knew, not someone lying unconscious in a hospital bed. As I looked at her with tears pouring down my cheeks, I was still in disbelief. I told her that I loved her and that everything will be okay. I know she heard me. I feel this in my heart and in my soul. I just stood back and stared. So many thoughts and emotions were running through me, and I was so afraid and very confused. I had to call Dan to tell him the bad news. However, I was very reluctant to call, since he was driving home on the highway from Chicago Airport, and I certainly didn't want him to go into a kind of shock, end up in an accident. I decided to wait a little, but it was too painful for me to wait any longer, and I just had to call him. Eliana was our firstborn child, and she meant the world to us. All of our children mean so much to us, both, but telling Dan of our daughter's situation and that it had become life-threatening would be something he wouldn't be able to fathom either. I was quick and tried to be positive when I spoke with him, although it was extremely difficult. He could hear that I was clearly upset and frightened. I knew my mother knew something had happened, since she could hear Dan's response to me on the phone. Even for her, it was something that she could not wrap her head around, and flying all this way at 76 years old was enough, never mind hearing about her granddaughter suddenly being rushed into hospital. How could she fathom that? In fact, how could any of us fathom it? I was amazed how together Dan sounded on the phone. I guess he had no choice. He had to savor every bit of strength in order to make his way to the hospital. I felt that the good spiritual powers were watching over him, and that they were helping him with his pain and disbelief. I called a friend of mine. Her name was Chris. Her daughter and Eliana had become friends over the summer and were in the same grade at school. Chris had just graduated from nursing school, and she was the type of person who would help someone in a dire situation. She had that quality about her. I called her to tell her what had happened to Eliana. She immediately dropped everything and came to the hospital. When she arrived, I hugged her. Chris also appeared to be shocked. In the meantime, I had to sign necessary documentation for the physician and the nurse to escort Eliana to Children's Hospital by helicopter. I don't remember reading the paperwork because I was so shaken at the time. All the writing on the forms became one long blur. Chris and I spent a few minutes talking to the flight crew, and then immediately we left to go to Children's Hospital. I literally felt helpless, like a person at sea with no anchor in sight. The car ride seemed like it took forever. Both Chris and I tried to think positively, but it was very difficult. Several minutes before we arrived at Children's Hospital, one of the flight crew members called me on my phone to tell me that Eliana was already in surgery. I remember feeling a small sense of comfort when they told me, because I knew Eliana was in good hands. However, what I didn't know was that this was the beginning of something I would never ever imagine could happen to our precious daughter. Soon after arriving at the hospital, we were given directions to the waiting room. As we walked into this large room, I was surprised to see many other families sat around, waiting on the news of their children. There seemed to be a lot of interaction and some laughter, which eased the atmosphere somewhat. Chris and I walked over to one of the empty tables and sat down. I told her how much I appreciated her driving me to the hospital because I would never have made the journey alone, since I felt so disoriented and that my mind had been clouded over with panic and worry. I was very happy she was there for me at that moment, and I felt comforted by her presence. Some time later, Dan walked in with Jessica, Daniel, and my mom. I was very happy to see my family. I tried to embrace my mom with a big hug. It's so difficult to really embrace her and welcome her because my mind was so focused on Eliana. After some time, one of the doctors walked into the room, hesitantly looking around, and said in somewhat of a quiet tone, "Boyd family." Dan and I looked at one another. I took one long, deep breath as we both stood up, and then we followed the doctor into a private room. Chris and my mom stayed with Daniel and Jessica. At that moment in time, I remember feeling like I was in some horrible dream, and I hoped I would wake up soon. I was so afraid. My mother had just arrived. Why weren't we chatting excitedly at the airport instead of being at the hospital bracing ourselves to hear what we didn't wish to hear? Dan and I were led into a very tiny room. I was scared as to what the doctor would have to say. As we entered into the room and sat down, the doctor looked at us with a very sullen expression. Dan and I sat across from him, waiting in anticipation. I could feel my heart racing so quickly that I felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. Anxiety started to set in within those few seconds, waiting for the words to come out of his mouth. The neurologist started to explain very briefly about the surgery and what they tried to do. He sounded very quiet, calm and collected. He told us since there was blood in the brain from the hemorrhage, the cranium has started to swell due to the excess buildup of cerebrospinal fluid. This buildup of fluid could lead to intracranial pressure, which could crush the brain tissue. Then the dreaded words were spoken. He said softly and hesitantly, I'm afraid Eliana is deep in the woods. There is very little chance she's going to make it. No, I cried, my heart literally sinking into my stomach. I felt I was going to be sick. I remember hanging my head, looking at the floor in such a daze. My mind had gone completely blank. Dan's hand started shaking. I grabbed his hand very tightly, which is the only comforting thing I could do in such dire situation. Holding hands was a small comfort for Dan and me. This couldn't ring true, I thought. This is impossible. I remember thinking, why? Why would this happen to her? I don't understand. Why wouldn't our daughter make it? Then during all this sadness and confusion, a little voice popped into my head, telling me the doctor didn't say that she wasn't going to make it, but he said that there would be little chance. So in my mind, there was still a glimmer of hope, which is all we had and fervently clung to during those long, dark days. Thank you for listening. I will continue this story in my next video. God bless.